Good afternoon, Mr. Hoffman.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Connell?
Thank you, Lord. Mr. Hoffman, we were working our way slowly through the hypotheses that had been discussed at the group on which you advised, as you explained to us. And I think ultimately you retired before the final throes of that group were completed. Can we just go back to these, and we go back to your witness statement at 199, please? Happened to my system. You just bear with us till I get my technology resolved, please. I don't know whether your lordship has the document on screen. I don't, but it may not matter.
When you say document,
The witness statement.
I have it in paper.
Yeah, right. Screens need adjusted, apparently. Yes, apologies for the delay, Mr. Hoffman, the wonders of technology.
Thank you.
I was going to page 199 of your witness statement, where hypothesis 4 is considered, which is a cylinder room and unfiltered outside air circulating in the cylinder room near the pediatric intensive care unit entering a patient room. Then the qualification is put that the case patient was in a PPVL room. Now, in the section that you set out in your witness statement immediately after that statement on page 199, you set out for a second time a point that we discussed fairly fully earlier about PPVL rooms and how they're apparently meant to operate. And you record at the top of page 200 that you have reservations about these, and we needn't go back to look at these again. But the essence of your concerns, I think, are expressed at the end of the first paragraph on page 200, where you say that depending on how this attempted PPVL protection operates, it could, I put it no higher than that, lead to contaminated air entering the room. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then you go on, I think, to raise a sort of definitional point, if I can call it that, about PPVL rooms, which we've touched on with other witnesses, but I might just take it from you, that you point out that in the report, what is said is the PPVL room is trying to achieve the best of both worlds. The room is ventilated. The lobby is under negative pressure to both patient room and ward corridor, with air being pulled in and extracted from the room and the ward corridor itself. And your point is that whatever is being described in that section is not a PPVL room outlined in the Scottish guidance.
What is being described is a room with a negative pressure lobby. That's not a positive pressure ventilated lobby room.
And you point out that in the guidance, and I might come back to guidance briefly with you later, the entry lobby is to be at plus 10 pascals with respect to the corridor, and this is not what's being described in the Cryptococcus report.
Yes.
And I think your conclusion on hypothesis 4 is that, well, it's possible some air could get in, but it might not be a significant component of the air, in which case, am I right in thinking that it then depends on how many particles of fungus if they are present, happen to come in with the modest element of air that comes from that source.
Yes, but there may well be significant volumes of air from unfiltered air from elsewhere that could come into the PPVL room.
Right. So I think that hypothesis was labelled possible in one case at least. And the next and perhaps most exotic of the hypotheses is the Helipad hypothesis that the downdraft was aerializing cryptococcal spores from pigeon guano dust into air intakes. And what happened, as we understand in the course of the group, was that another expert was instructed to do a computational fluid dynamics study on this particular point about airflows during helicopter activity. Now, you quite properly say in the middle of your answer to question 24, you have no expertise in CFD, but then go on to describe what you understand it to be. And there are different phrases all appear in the one sentence: precise, approximate, and sporadic. Now, you say it's a precise mathematical modeling. So I think I understand that. But then you say it can be based on input data that are approximate and sporadic. Can you just help us understand what point you're making about CFD at that stage?
CFD is mathematical modelling. The mathematics itself, although I don't understand it, I believe to be a very precise model. A model depends on what assumptions and parameters you put in there to be modelled. So not a lot is known about the whole bundle of variables that might affect fungal spore resuspension that can be fed into this model. So you're putting in a series of assumptions that may or may not include relevant factors, that may or not be relevant assumptions into a precise model. So it's a precise model of some assumptions, other assumptions the modelers might be totally unaware of and have left out. So this is essentially what is fed in are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So the model is only as accurate as those assumptions are both accurate and complete. This is often not the case.
However, that said, you're recorded as saying that this particular hypothesis is unlikely to be correct because either the pigeon guano will be firmly stuck and therefore not mobilized by the helicopter airflows. Alternatively, if they weren't, then every time the helicopter takes off and lands, it will shift them and therefore they don't build up. That's what you're, I think, saying in that hypothesis.
Correct. This is very similar to what I was saying about particles within ductwork earlier on. Either they are light and are going to get moved out very rapidly, or they're heavy, in this case stuck to a surface, and don't form part of the game.
So that's a hypothesis that was marked as unlikely. Then hypothesis 6. Now we've had some evidence about this pneumatic tube sample conveyance system, which replaced the need for, or reduced the need for porters to take samples from A to B to be analysed. And I think we probably understand, at least in general terms, how it operates. So is the question about this hypothesis really about the amount of air that will be released into any particular environment each time the system is opened for the purpose of inserting or removing a sample?
I'm sorry, I didn't get a question there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I don't think there was a question.
I'll reframe that. The pneumatic tube system moves sample containers around. I'm probably not using the right word. I think somebody used the word pods via compressed air drawn from a plant room, a different plant room as it turns out. So they then discharge that air into the treatment room when they're open to remove the traveling pod having reached its destination. And I think I was trying to get to an understanding of whether the real question about this as a hypothesis is focused on the amount of air that we're talking about, which sounds very small, but maybe I'm wrong in understanding what the point is. Why is this hypothesis not likely?
I'm not sure I have a reliable understanding of the pneumatics of these transport pod systems. I gathered from what was spoken about at the various meetings that the volumes of air involved were fairly small, and I'm not sure that the major air discharge points were necessarily in clinical areas. But this is not something I understand in great depth.
But if one assumed that, and because there's, I think, a quote from you in your statement, if you assumed that a small amount of air did emerge into a patient room, you're noted as saying, well, that amount is likely to be very small in context.
I think the air would emerge outside a patient room in more communal area of the ward, and I can see comparatively little of that getting into a patient room compared with all other sources of unfiltered air.
The final hypothesis 7 is described as dormancy and reactivation, which appears to be the proposition that someone has acquired the Cryptococcus bug elsewhere, and then it reactivates when they're in the hospital. And your position on that, as I understand it, is it's simply not an area on which you had any expertise to allow you to comment on.
That is correct.
I suppose the only question I have for you is this, given your long experience with hospitals and hospital infections and associated matters. Pigeons are, well, let's say that they're not an uncommon bird to encounter in various locations, including urban locations, whether we're talking about Trafalgar Square or anywhere else. They're a fairly ubiquitous bird. And therefore, is it fair to say that if it was a common thing, i.e. acquisition of the Cryptococcus bug and then going into hospital and reactivating, you would perhaps expect to see it's similar incidents to the one we're talking about here in various locations? Or can't you help us with that?
I really don't know what the incidence of Cryptococcus occurrence is as normality in hospital, so I don't think I can help.
So all you can say is you hadn't come across it.
It has not been brought to my attention, correct.
Thank you. Having talked through the various hypotheses, the issues, the possibilities, the knowns and the unknowns, I'm just trying now to assess what overall conclusion might be feasible. You're asked in the witness statement what you thought of the report, and you've made some comments on it. What I'm interested in is part of your answer 28, where you say this: I would not refer to the likelihood assigned to individual hypotheses as conclusions, but more as assessments of possibilities. That definitive conclusions were missing is perhaps a realistic reflection of abilities to establish what precisely occurred in each phase of patient acquisition of Cryptococcus. Now, in the course of your evidence earlier today, we've been talking about possibilities, likelihoods, question marks, if I can put it that way. Perhaps with the possible exception of the helipad, would you expect phrases like conclusively ruled out to be used about any of the hypotheses that we've been discussing?
I don't think so. What I was doing in my answer was rather taking issue with the word conclusions in the question I was asked. I think they're an exploration of possibilities. I don't think the report has arrived at conclusions.
Thank you. I think that you were asked one further question about the Cryptococcus issue, which appears on page 203 of your witness statement, where you're asked, or you're told that another 4 cases of Cryptococcus, or possible Cryptococcus within the hospital have been found. You say you're unaware of this, and you're asked if it makes any difference. And you say it doesn't make any difference, the fact that there have been other cases found. Is that right?
Correct.
So it wouldn't make any difference to your assessment of the hypotheses if further cases emerged?
No, because the hypotheses are still as valid or not as valid as they remain for one case as for, say, 6 or 7 cases. And there doesn't have to be a single route of transmission. If however many people, let's suppose 6, have acquired it, there could be 6 different routes of transmission.
And based on the information that you had, would you be able to say to us today how any of these 6 were likely to have got it or not? That's simply not known.
It would be impossible for me to say with any degree of certainty what the route or routes of transmission for each case had been.
Okay, well, I'd like to leave Cryptococcus now and perhaps return briefly to a couple of things that arose from your earlier evidence. I wanted to ask you, first of all, about performance of air handling units in producing air change rates. It doesn't matter what the rate is just for the present question. Do you know, and please say if you don't, is it correct that the performance of an air handling unit when installed, which let's say for the sake of argument produces 6 air changes an hour, will deteriorate over the passage of time, so that sometime later, even if maintained in the routine way, it may be producing less than 6 air changes an hour? Is that something that is an accepted fact?
This is engineering that I'm not very familiar with. My understanding is that many modern air handling units have variable power motors for the fans so that they can compensate for filters blocking up. So there would be 2 types of deterioration. One is the motor not achieving what it's meant to, so the fan rotates more slowly. I think that would not be typical of modern air handling units. The other is of filters blocking up and not being able to pass as much air as they should do. Now, this would be detected, hopefully, on the building management system by the pressure differential across the filter, and the filter would be changed before it gets to a critical point. So there might be minor impairment of the ability of the system to provide precisely the volume of air or the rate of air that it was supposed to, but this should be detected and corrected routinely.
So if you were envisaging a period of time between installation of the filter and replacement of the filter, if you were, say, 3/4 of the way, or just to take a figure, through that period, the performance of the system may have deteriorated, but hadn't quite reached the alarm point yet.
It may have deteriorated. I think that deterioration will be marginal, and in many modern systems, there will be feedback to a variable speed motor that could increase the rate that air was being supplied to the filter to compensate for filter blockage.
Thank you. I just want to ask you one other thing. In the course of, you remember I showed you I won't call it a specification, but a list of features that might have been expected for a BMT unit room, which included 10 pascals, HEPA filtration, and so on, and also had 10 air changes an hour, which that particular compilation you said was an amalgamation of your views and presumably HPS, who were marked as the other contributors. And your view was that the air changes were irrelevant. Really, I just have two things to ask you there. One is, do you accept that both HTMO301 and SHTMO301 have tables in them suggesting, for instance, 10 air changes for a neutropenic area?
Yes.
So the guidance or advice, or however we want to label them, we won't quibble over the words, does nevertheless include required air changes, largely of 6 and then of 10 in a series of specialized areas.
That, yes, I would accept that.
So do you not give any significance to air change rates in ensuring patient safety in these areas?
No, I believe they're for patient comfort.
So even if 10 air change rates were advised, you would say that's still just for patient comfort?
Yes.
Well, to state the obvious, we have heard evidence that there are significant infrastructure implications involved in achieving an air change rate of 10 as opposed to an air change rate of 6. Are you going the distance of saying that the recommendations in the health technical memoranda are superfluous?
I regard them as being superfluous in terms of patient risk in highly neutropenic patients. Yes.
Again, and forgive me for repeating myself, does this depend on the premise that the environment within which a neutropenic patient is being treated has been filtered to the degree of a HEPA filter?
I regard these as two independent factors. If it's not HEPA filtered air, then there is a lower reliability of fungal spore removal, and that depends precisely on what type of filtration the sub-HEPA filtration is. But earlier on, I was talking about the ventilation for these rooms being about exclusion of fungal spores, not dilution of anything, and I stand by that.
Right, so the purpose of filtration is to exclude.
Yes.
Right. Do you see dilution of air by reason of the number of air changes that are applicable to a particular space as having any infection protection and control function in spaces which have, well, first question, filtered at a specification below HEPA filtration?
If you are supplying air which is contaminated with, say, fungal spores, then you can supply it at any rate you like. It doesn't make any difference to the concentration of fungal spores. They will be in the supplied air.
Right, because you have a constant, you assume a constant content of fungal spores.
Yes. So imagine you're putting contaminated air into a bath. Doesn't matter at what rate that air goes into the bath, it's the same contaminated water.
And I think at the moment, if that applies to fungal spores, would you say that applies equally to any other microorganisms in the air supply?
In the air supply, yes. I think the question here is whether relevant microbes are generated within the patient room, not in the air supply, but within the patient room, that are a risk to the patient. I can't see what they would be.
So that brings me back. I think, listening to what you say, your position would be that in a ventilated space within a hospital, you can't see the role for air change rate as impacting on infection risk.
What I said applies specifically to accommodation for highly immunocompromised patients that is positively pressured. It definitely does not apply to areas where you have patients who are infectious. Their airborne dilution plays a significant role. There's a difference between protective isolation and source isolation.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, I really only have one further question to follow that. During the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion over the fact that somebody might be exhaling particles infected with COVID, whatever the number was, into the environment even before they were necessarily symptomatic, coughing and sneezing and all that kind of stuff. And that was one of the issues. Now, if you envisage then the possibility of an individual entering the room of an immunocompromised patient who was COVID positive and emitting these particles, would a higher degree of dilution not be helpful in a situation like that?
The whole science around that is very poorly established, and mainly by mathematical modelling with imprecise inputs. I would see there the major risk as being from larger particles, splashes and droplets, rather than aerosols. But this is certainly not well established.
I have nothing further for this witness, my lord.
Mr. Hoffman, I have to check if there are other questions in the room. So we will break off our contact with you for what I would hope to be no more than 10 minutes or so in order to find out whether there's any more questioning. And we'll get back to you.
Okay, so about 2:40?
About, let's say, 2:45.
Fine, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Connell?
My lord, no further questions have been intimated to me.
Mr. Hoffman, no further questions, apparently, and therefore that's the end of your testimony today. Before we break contact, can I express my thanks both for your attendance, your online attendance today, but also the work in preparing your witness statement and reading the documents we provided you with. So many thanks indeed, but we'll now say goodbye this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Connell, we, I think, plan to resume tomorrow. Is that correct?
That is correct, Lord.
Again at 10 o'clock, I think.
Yes.
Right. Well, can I wish everyone a good afternoon, and we'll see each other at 10 tomorrow.